What would make a man who once said, "I will protect my wife at all costs," suddenly stop protecting the marriage itself? Not a tabloid headline, not a rumor, not even public humiliation. Something else, something private, something that arrived quietly, landed heavily, and refused to be ignored. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Because this story doesn't begin with a divorce filing. It begins with a moment of realization so unsettling that it rewired everything Prince Harry thought he knew about love, loyalty, power, and the woman he built his new life around. And here's the uncomfortable question no one wants to ask out loud. What if the breakup wasn't about falling out of love, but about discovering the truth too late? Let's be clear right from the start. This is not a neat story. It doesn't fit into the tidy boxes of good guy and bad guy. It's a slow burn unraveling, a psychological collision between devotion and survival. And at its center is a man who spent years fighting the world for his marriage, only to find himself fighting something much closer to home. Ask yourself this: how far would you go to protect someone you love? Would you sacrifice your reputation, your family, your future? Prince Harry already did all of that. So what could possibly be left that would make him stop? That's where this story really begins. Because long before the word divorce was ever whispered, there were signs. Not the loud, obvious ones that tabloids obsess over, but the subtle shifts. The pauses, the recalibrations, the moments where something didn't quite line up. Think about it. For years, Harry's narrative was simple and unshakable, us against the world. He framed the relationship as a refuge from cruelty, a shield against history repeating itself. Every criticism was reframed as persecution. Every doubt was dismissed as malice. And audiences bought it. Many still do. But here's the contradiction that matters. When someone is truly certain, they don't need to keep convincing themselves. And over time, Harry's certainty began to sound strained. Shorter sentences, carefully chosen silences, a shift from defiance to defensiveness. These weren't accidents. They were signals. Signals that something behind the scenes was changing. Now, imagine this. You've built your identity around one defining decision. You've burned bridges. You've spoken publicly, emotionally, irrevocably. You've positioned yourself in opposition to institutions that shaped your entire life. And then, privately, you're confronted with information that reframes everything. Not gossip, not speculation. Information. The kind that makes your stomach drop. The kind that doesn't explode immediately, but seeps in slowly, poisoning certainty from the inside. Here's the part that makes people uncomfortable. Betrayal doesn't always look like cheating. Sometimes it looks like omission. Sometimes it looks like strategic silence. Sometimes it looks like allowing someone to fight battles they don't fully understand. Have you ever defended someone so fiercely that you never stopped to ask whether they were defending you? That's the emotional trap at the heart of this story. Because Harry didn't wake up one morning and decide to leave. He didn't snap. He didn't crumble in a dramatic confrontation. What happened was far more unsettling. He realized something didn't belong to him anymore. The narrative. For a long time, Harry believed he was the author of his own escape story. The rebel prince. The protector. The man who chose love over duty. But what happens when you start to suspect you're not the author, but the character? What happens when you realize that some of the choices you thought were mutual may have been guided, nudged, even engineered? This is where the word blackmail enters the conversation, not as a cartoon villain trope, but as a quiet, suffocating pressure. Blackmail isn't always a threat shouted across a table. Often, it's a shared understanding, a sense that certain things cannot be undone, certain truths cannot be spoken, certain exits are far more dangerous than staying. And in royal circles, where reputation is currency and silence is survival, leverage doesn't need to be explicit to be effective. Let me ask you something directly. If your marriage became entangled with information that could destroy not just your public image, but your children's future, would you fight louder or retreat carefully? Harry, for a long time, fought louder. But then something shifted. Notice how the tone changed. Notice how the fire cooled. Notice how the defiance softened into something closer to calculation. That's not exhaustion. That's reassessment. And reassessment usually follows revelation. Here's another uncomfortable truth. When people say, "I never saw it coming," what they often mean is, "I didn't want to look." Because the signs were there. The way certain stories were amplified while others were buried. The way allies appeared and disappeared at convenient moments. The way responsibility always flowed outward, never inward. At first, Harry framed it as protection, then as strategy, then, eventually, as necessity. But necessity for whom? This is the moment where many viewers will want to pick a side. Resist that instinct. This story isn't about heroes and villains. It's about power dynamics inside a relationship that was never allowed to be normal. From the very beginning, the marriage existed under extraordinary conditions. Media pressure, legal battles, family fractures, financial recalibration, identity reinvention. Under those conditions, love doesn't just exist. It performs. And when love becomes performative, it becomes fragile. Ask yourself, how much of their relationship unfolded privately, and how much unfolded as narrative? Because when narratives become more important than truth, something eventually breaks. And here's the part that truly matters. Harry didn't lose faith in love. He lost faith in alignment. Alignment of goals. Alignment of truth. Alignment of risk. When one person is willing to risk everything and the other is managing outcomes, the imbalance becomes unsustainable. That's not betrayal in the cinematic sense. It's betrayal in the existential sense. And once that realization lands, it cannot be unlearned. This is why the divorce, if and when it is formally declared, won't feel explosive. It will feel inevitable. Because emotionally, the rupture already happened. Privately, quietly, and long before the public was meant to notice. So as we move forward in this story, keep this in mind. The most dangerous moment in any relationship is not the fight. It's the moment one person stops fighting for the same reasons. Because the night everything changed didn't involve raised voices or slammed doors. It involved silence. And a question Harry could no longer avoid. What if staying costs more than leaving? But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. Was it a single sentence that did it? Or was it the silence that followed? Because the night everything changed didn't announce itself with drama. There were no slammed doors, no raised voices, no explosive confrontation that would later leak to the press. What happened was quieter than that, and far more dangerous. Picture this. It's late, later than it should be. The kind of late where the world feels paused and your thoughts get louder because there's nothing left to distract them. The house is still, too still. The kind of stillness that makes every small sound feel intrusive. Footsteps in another room, the hum of electronics, a phone vibrating when you weren't expecting it to. Now ask yourself, how many life-altering moments happen in absolute silence? Most of them. Because this wasn't about anger. It was about clarity. And clarity is ruthless. The question that haunted that night wasn't, do I love her? It was something far more unsettling. What am I actually defending? That question didn't come out of nowhere. It had been circling for months, maybe longer, like a thought he kept pushing away because it threatened the entire structure of his life. Every time it surfaced, he buried it under responsibility, under loyalty, under the story he'd been telling himself and the world. But that night, something broke through. Not a rumor, not a headline, not an accusation shouted from the outside. Information, the kind that doesn't scream, but whispers. The kind that doesn't accuse, but reveals. The kind that doesn't demand a reaction, because it knows it will get one. Here's the thing people misunderstand about moments like this. They imagine shock, panic, rage. But the real reaction is slower. It's disbelief first, then denial, then a strange, hollow calm. That calm is where the danger lives. Because once you're calm, you start connecting dots. And when the dots connect, they form pictures you can't unsee. Think about the timing. Think about the context. This was a man who had spent years in a defensive crouch, constantly bracing for the next attack. He had trained himself to assume bad faith everywhere. Media, institutions, even family. That mindset served a purpose. It unified. It simplified. It created a clear enemy. But what happens when the discomfort isn't coming from outside? What happens when the pressure is internal? That night, the realization wasn't explosive. It was incremental. One detail leading to another. A contradiction brushing up against a memory. A past decision suddenly reframed in a different light. Have you ever replayed an old conversation in your head and thought, how did I miss that? That's what this was. Moments he had rationalized. choices he had defended, sacrifices he had made without ever questioning whether the playing field was level. And here's the part that changes everything. This wasn't about a single betrayal. It was about a pattern. A pattern of information asymmetry. One person always knowing more. One person always controlling the timing. One person always deciding when the truth was necessary and when it wasn't. At first, that imbalance feels like protection, like leadership, like strategy. But over time, it starts to feel like containment. Ask yourself this. When does protection become control? That night, Harry wasn't angry. He was unsettled. Because anger is easy to direct. Unsettlement forces introspection. He started thinking about moments he had brushed aside. Moments where decisions felt rushed. Where urgency replaced deliberation. Where the stakes were framed as so high that hesitation felt irresponsible. If we don't act now, if we don't respond immediately, if we don't draw a line today, those phrases are powerful. They compress time. They eliminate alternatives. They force alignment. And for a long time, he believed that alignment was mutual. But what if it wasn't? What if some of those fires had been stoked, not extinguished? That's the thought that landed hardest. Because once you ask that question, you have to ask another. Who benefits? Not emotionally, strategically. Who benefited from the escalation? Who benefited from the polarization? Who benefited from the permanent state of conflict? This is where the narrative starts to crack. For years, the story had been framed as survival, as escape, as self-preservation. And to be fair, much of that was true. But survival stories are dangerous when they become identities. Because once you see yourself as always under threat, every action becomes justified, including the ones that hurt the people closest to you. That night, Harry realized something else too. He had been the loud one, the shield, the spokesperson, the emotional lightning rod. He had absorbed the backlash, the ridicule, the loss of status, the burning of bridges. And he did it willingly, proudly. Because that was the deal. Or at least, that was the version of the deal he understood. But what if the cost wasn't shared equally? What if the risk distribution wasn't what he thought? That's when the silence in the room changed. It stopped being empty and started feeling heavy. Because the more he traced decisions backward, the more he noticed something unsettling. The margin for error was always his. His relationships, his reputation, his standing. He was the one who couldn't go back. And that realization reframed everything. This wasn't about blame. It was about agency. When did he stop being an equal partner and start being the point of no return? That question doesn't lead to a fight. It leads to withdrawal. Because once you see yourself as the leverage point, you start asking why. Why were certain truths delayed? Why were certain risks minimized? Why were certain outcomes presented as inevitable? This is where people misunderstand betrayal. They imagine intent, malice, conspiracy. But the most damaging betrayals don't require evil intent. They require convenience. Convenience in letting someone else carry the weight. Convenience in letting someone else be the face of the fallout. Convenience in letting someone else burn the bridges so you never have to cross back. And suddenly, that old question came back with sharper edges. What am I actually defending? Not the marriage. That answer was too simple. The narrative. The version of events that made everything make sense. The version where sacrifices were mutual and risks were shared and truth flowed freely. But narratives collapse when facts change. And the fact that haunted him that night was this. There were things he didn't know when he made irreversible decisions. And once irreversible decisions are made under incomplete information, trust fractures. Because consent requires knowledge. You can't consent to consequences you don't fully understand. That realization is devastating. Not because it proves betrayal, but because it introduces doubt. And doubt is lethal to certainty. He didn't confront anyone that night. He didn't accuse. He didn't explode. He sat with it. Let it settle. Let it sting. And in that quiet, another realization emerged. If he brought this up, everything would change. Not just the relationship, the equilibrium, the unspoken rules, the understanding that some things stayed buried for the greater good. If he spoke, the game would shift. And that's when the word that terrified him more than divorce crossed his mind. Exposure. Because once certain truths surface, they don't just hurt one person. They detonate entire ecosystems, reputations, alliances, futures. That's when the shape of the dilemma became clear. Staying meant accepting a version of reality where he would never again be fully certain he was acting with all the facts. Leaving meant risking consequences that couldn't be controlled. Either way, the cost would be enormous. So he did the only thing someone in that position can do. He waited. Waited to see if the truth would surface on its own. Waited to see if transparency would arrive without being demanded. Waited to see if alignment could be restored. Because sometimes the most revealing thing isn't what people say when confronted. It's what they volunteer when they're not. And what didn't come was just as telling as what did. Because the silence continued. Carefully. Strategically. Comfortably. That's when Harry understood something that changed the trajectory of his life. If you have to demand the truth, it's already too late. And once that realization sets in, love doesn't disappear, but trust begins to hemorrhage. He didn't decide to leave that night. But he did decide something else. He decided to stop assuming. And once you stop assuming, everything changes. Because the next step isn't confrontation. It's observation. Watching patterns. Tracking inconsistencies. Noticing who flinches and who doesn't when certain topics arise. And that quiet shift, from defender to observer, is the beginning of the end. Because what Harry would notice next would force him to choose between silence and survival. And that choice was coming faster than anyone realized. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. What happens when a marriage is built in a firestorm? Not tested by pressure, not shaped by it, built inside it. Because once Harry stopped assuming, once he shifted from defender to observer, the past started replaying itself differently. Not emotionally at first. Structurally, he began asking a question that had never felt safe to ask before. Was this relationship ever allowed to be normal? That question sounds harmless. It isn't. Because if the foundation is unstable, everything built on top of it becomes a negotiation with gravity. And suddenly, the early days, the whirlwind, the intensity, the urgency, didn't look like destiny anymore. They looked like compression. Think back to the beginning. Not the fairy tale version. The real one. Two people meeting under extraordinary circumstances. One already famous, already scrutinized, already carrying generational trauma. The other stepping into the most unforgiving spotlight on earth. There was no gentle slope. No slow burn. No private space to figure things out without consequence. Every step was amplified. Every glance analyzed. Every pause interpreted. Under those conditions, love doesn't unfold. It accelerates. And acceleration feels intoxicating. It feels like fate. It feels like clarity. But acceleration also eliminates reflection. Ask yourself something honestly. How well can you truly know someone when the world is screaming at you to choose a side immediately? From the very beginning, the relationship existed in crisis mode. Not because the people involved wanted it that way, but because the environment demanded it. And crisis mode does something dangerous to human psychology. It simplifies. It creates binaries. Us versus them. Safe versus unsafe. Loyalty versus betrayal. Nuance doesn't survive in crisis. Doubt becomes disloyalty. Questions become threats. That dynamic bonded them quickly, fiercely, but it also set a trap. Because when love is forged in opposition, it needs an enemy to stay alive. Early on, the enemy was obvious. The media, the tabloids, the institution, the faceless machine Harry had been fighting since childhood. That made sense to him. It aligned perfectly with his history, his wounds, his identity. So when Meghan entered his life and the storm intensified, the narrative felt familiar. Almost scripted. Protect her. Fight back. Never let history repeat itself. Who wouldn't respond that way? But here's the contradiction Harry began noticing only much later. The conflict never de-escalated. No matter what they did. No matter how far they went. No matter how much ground they gave up. The pressure didn't ease. It migrated. From tabloids to institutions. From institutions to family. From family to internal circles. That's not typical. In most crises, when you remove yourself from the source of harm, the intensity drops. Here, it didn't. And that raised a disturbing question. Was the pressure external, or was it being sustained internally? This is where memory starts to reframe itself. The rushed decisions. The we have to do this now moments. The sense that waiting was more dangerous than acting. At the time, those decisions felt protective, necessary, heroic, even. But seen through a different lens, they looked like something else. Irreversibility. Each step forward burned a bridge behind him. Each declaration narrowed his options. Each public stand made retreat less possible. And slowly, without realizing it, Harry crossed a threshold. He stopped being someone who could choose freely. He became someone whose past choices dictated his future. That's a terrifying place to wake up, especially when you realize you may not have been holding all the information when those choices were made. Now, pause for a moment and ask yourself, have you ever committed so fully to a version of events that questioning it later felt like betraying yourself? That's the psychological bind Harry was in. Because if he questioned the foundation, he'd have to confront the possibility that he moved too fast, trusted too completely, assumed alignment where there may have been strategy, and that possibility was unbearable for a long time. So instead, he doubled down. Publicly, he defended harder, spoke louder, drew sharper lines. But here's the thing about doubling down. It works until it doesn't. Because pressure-cooked bonds don't gradually loosen. They fracture suddenly. Harry began noticing how often urgency was used as justification. We can't wait. We can't explain everything. We can't afford hesitation. Those phrases had once felt like survival tools. Now, they sounded like control mechanisms. Not necessarily intentional, not necessarily malicious, but effective. Because urgency collapses debate. It forces compliance. It frames disagreement as danger. And in a relationship already defined by external threat, urgency becomes irresistible. This is where people get uncomfortable, so let's slow down. This is not about accusing anyone of manipulation. It's about acknowledging how power dynamics evolve under stress. When one partner has more information, more media experience, more strategic awareness of narrative, the balance shifts, especially when the other partner is emotionally invested in protection above all else. Harry was emotionally invested in protection. Deeply. That was his role, his identity, his promise. To himself, to the memory of his mother, to the world. And once someone knows your identity, they don't need to control you directly. They just need to activate the part of you that will act on its own. That's what makes this so complicated. Because Harry wasn't coerced. He was motivated. Motivated by love. Motivated by fear. Motivated by history. And motivated people don't feel controlled. They feel righteous. It took time for that righteousness to cool into something else. Doubt. And doubt arrived not through accusation, but through pattern recognition. He began noticing how often the relationship required him to be the public shield. How often silence was presented as strategy, but only when it benefited one direction. How often he absorbed backlash while the internal narrative remained tightly managed. Again, none of this felt alarming in isolation. But together, it painted a picture. A marriage that didn't just endure pressure, but required it. That's the key insight. Some relationships survive storms. Others depend on them. Because storms keep partners aligned. They keep priorities clear. They keep the outside world hostile enough that internal questions feel dangerous. Harry began to wonder, quietly, privately, what would happen if the storm ended? Would there still be alignment? Would there still be transparency? Would there still be mutual risk? Or would the absence of crisis expose fractures that had always been there? This is the moment where many people realize something painful. They didn't fall out of love. They fell out of illusion. And illusion is powerful when it's reinforced by applause, outrage, and constant motion. But when the noise fades, what's left has to stand on its own. Harry's life had finally slowed enough for him to hear his own thoughts. And those thoughts weren't accusing. They were questioning. Why did everything always feel like an emergency? Why did reflection feel discouraged? Why did some topics carry invisible tripwires? These are not the questions of a man planning a divorce. They are the questions of a man rediscovering agency. And once agency returns, dependency weakens. That's when the emotional equation shifts. Protection turns into evaluation. Defense turns into distance. Loyalty turns into conditional trust. Harry hadn't left yet. But the marriage, as it had existed, was no longer intact. Because it was built to survive pressure, not scrutiny. And scrutiny was finally turning inward. The most dangerous thing for any relationship forged in crisis is calm. Because calm invites honesty. And honesty, in this case, threatened to unravel years of decisions that could never be undone. Harry didn't confront that truth all at once. He approached it carefully, almost reluctantly, because he knew something else too. If he pulled at this thread, everything else might come apart, and he wasn't sure yet whether he was ready for that. But the thread had been pulled, and what it would reveal next would force him to choose between the version of love he fought for and the version of truth he could no longer ignore. When does loyalty stop being love and start becoming obligation? That was the question Harry couldn't shake once the storm quieted. Because once you step out of constant crisis, you don't suddenly feel peace. You feel exposed, raw, vulnerable to thoughts you didn't have time for before. And those thoughts kept circling one uncomfortable idea. What if loyalty itself had become the trap? For years, Harry had worn loyalty like armor. He defended. He explained. He absorbed blows meant for two people, but carried by one. Loyalty gave him purpose when everything else felt chaotic. But loyalty has a shadow side no one talks about. Loyalty discourages curiosity. Loyalty reframes doubt as betrayal. Loyalty makes silence feel virtuous, even when it hurts. And slowly, Harry began to realize that his loyalty had outpaced his understanding. Ask yourself this honestly. Have you ever defended someone so fiercely that you stopped checking whether the fight was still yours? That's where Harry found himself. Because once he stopped reacting and started observing, he noticed something deeply unsettling. The emotional rules of the marriage were asymmetrical. He was expected to show unwavering loyalty publicly, instantly, without hesitation. But transparency? That arrived on a delay. Selective, timed, strategic. Again, this didn't scream manipulation. It whispered imbalance. The kind that grows quietly because everyone involved benefits, until one person doesn't. Harry began replaying old moments with new ears. The times he was told, you don't need to know everything. The times he was assured, this will all make sense later. The times urgency replaced explanation. At the time, he accepted those answers because they aligned with his instinct to protect. Because questioning felt dangerous. Because the cost of not acting seemed catastrophic. But now, without the adrenaline of constant crisis, those moments felt different. They felt unfinished. And unfinished truths are corrosive. Here's the uncomfortable reality most people never confront. When one partner carries the emotional risk and the other carries the informational advantage, the relationship stops being equal, even if both people believe they're acting in good faith. Harry wasn't being ordered. He was being guided. Guided toward decisions that made retreat impossible. Guided toward positions that required absolute commitment. Guided toward a future that increasingly depended on maintaining a single, fragile narrative. And narratives are powerful things. They don't just shape how others see you. They shape how you see yourself. For years, Harry saw himself as the protector, the one standing between his wife and a cruel world. That identity gave meaning to sacrifice. It justified loss. But what happens when you realize your identity has been doing the work of control? That realization doesn't arrive gently. It arrives like vertigo. Because if the role you embraced was part of a system you didn't fully understand, then the choices you made under that role demand re-examination. And re-examination is terrifying, because it forces you to confront this question. If I had known then what I know now, would I have done the same things? Harry didn't like where that question led, so he tried to silence it. He told himself every marriage has blind spots, that trust requires leaps of faith, that unity matters more than details. All reasonable thoughts, but they didn't stop the pattern from becoming clearer. He noticed how often emotional appeals were used to short-circuit discussion, how often pain was presented as proof, how often urgency was framed as morality. If you love me, you'll do this now. If you hesitate, you're helping them. If you question this, you're repeating history. Those are powerful phrases. They don't argue facts. They trigger fear. And fear makes people loyal long after clarity fades. Harry had lived his entire life under the shadow of fear. Fear of loss. Fear of repetition. Fear of becoming passive in the face of harm. That made him uniquely vulnerable to emotional acceleration. Again, not because anyone planned it that way, but because the conditions were perfect. A traumatized prince. A relentless media cycle. A romance unfolding under global scrutiny. Add urgency to that equation, and you get momentum that's almost impossible to stop. Momentum doesn't ask questions. Momentum just moves. And Harry had been moving for a long time. What finally slowed him wasn't anger. It was contradiction. Small ones at first. Statements that didn't quite match outcomes. assurances that didn't age well, strategies that required increasingly elaborate explanations. Each contradiction chipped away at certainty, and certainty was the glue holding everything together. Without certainty, loyalty began to feel less like devotion and more like obligation. And obligation breeds resentment, even in the most loving hearts. Harry didn't want to resent his wife, so he tried to rationalize. Maybe this is just stress. Maybe this is what partnership looks like under pressure. Maybe I'm overthinking. But here's the problem with overthinking as an excuse. It assumes the thinking is wrong. And what if it isn't? What if the discomfort isn't paranoia, but intuition finally getting airtime? That's when Harry noticed something else. Whenever he pulled back emotionally, even slightly, the system reacted. Not with open confrontation, with concern, with reassurance, with reminders of what was at stake. The kids, the media, the enemies waiting to exploit weakness. These weren't threats. They were truths. But truths can still function as constraints. Because when every hesitation carries catastrophic framing, autonomy shrinks. And autonomy is essential to intimacy. You can't truly choose someone if leaving feels impossible. That's when Harry understood something that changed how he saw the marriage. Love had become entangled with survival. And when love becomes survival-based, it stops being free. This is the point where many relationships reach a crossroads. One path leads to deeper transparency. The other leads to tighter control. Harry hoped, quietly, that transparency would come. That unanswered questions would be addressed voluntarily. That gaps would be filled without pressure. That alignment would be restored through openness. But instead, he encountered something else. Maintenance. The careful maintenance of a story that had grown too large to dismantle safely. And that's when the word he had avoided began to take shape in his mind. Not as an accusation, but as a reality. Leverage. Not crude, not overt, but present. Leverage built from timing, from silence, from the irreversible nature of his past decisions. Harry realized that his loyalty had created leverage he never intended to give. Because the more he sacrificed, the less room he had to walk away. That's not love. That's captivity by consequence. And the most painful part? He helped build it. This wasn't a villain story. It was a tragedy of alignment gone wrong. Two people entering a relationship under extraordinary pressure. One adapting through strategy, the other through sacrifice. Over time, those adaptations diverged. And once divergence happens, loyalty alone can't fix it. Harry hadn't confronted anyone yet. But emotionally, something had shifted. He stopped volunteering defenses, stopped rushing to preempt criticism, stopped framing every challenge as an attack from the outside. He was no longer fighting for us by default. He was evaluating. And evaluation is dangerous when the foundation is fragile. Because once you see the cracks, you can't unsee them. And Harry was starting to see a lot. What he would discover next wouldn't come from confrontation or confession. It would come from something far more revealing. Behavior under pressure. Because when control begins to slip, people reveal what they value most. And what Harry was about to witness would force him to decide whether loyalty was still protecting love or protecting a lie. What do people do when they sense control slipping? They don't panic right away. They adjust. And that adjustment was what finally made everything unmistakable. Because once Harry stopped offering automatic loyalty, the environment around him subtly changed. Not in obvious ways. Not with confrontation or anger, but with pressure that felt refined, calibrated. That's the thing about control. It doesn't always tighten like a fist. Sometimes it smooths like a glove. Harry began to notice how reactions shifted when he hesitated. When he asked follow-up questions instead of nodding. When he paused before agreeing. Nothing explosive happened. Instead, concern appeared. Are you okay? You seem tired. This has all been so hard on you. On the surface, those were caring statements. Loving, even. But underneath them was a familiar framing. You're overwhelmed. You're stressed. You're not seeing clearly right now. That framing matters. Because once your doubts are attributed to exhaustion rather than substance, they stop being addressed. They get managed. Harry had lived his whole life being managed. By aides. By institutions. By tradition. He didn't expect to feel it inside his marriage. That realization didn't arrive all at once. It arrived through repetition. Every time he questioned timing, the urgency was emphasized. Every time he asked for clarity, the emotional cost was highlighted. Every time he slowed down, the risks were amplified. Do you really want to give them ammunition? Do you know how this will look? Is now really the moment to second guess? Those questions didn't accuse. They redirected. And redirection, repeated often enough, becomes containment. Harry started paying attention not just to what was said, but to what wasn't. Certain topics never stayed open for long. Certain names triggered immediate pivots. Certain timelines were treated as immovable facts rather than choices. That's when something clicked. The marriage wasn't just navigating pressure. It was organized around it. An organization implies intention, even if no one consciously planned it that way. This is where the story becomes uncomfortable because it forces a distinction people hate making. Intent versus impact. You don't need malicious intent to create a system that benefits one person more than the other. You just need unequal risk. Harry's risk was always visible, public, immediate. The other risks were abstract, deferred, hypothetical, and abstract risks are easy to downplay, especially when someone else is absorbing the concrete consequences. That imbalance showed up most clearly in one place: decision-making. Every major turning point in Harry's recent life had been framed as urgent, unavoidable, and time-sensitive. There was always a reason waiting was dangerous. Always a reason explaining was impossible. Always a reason silence was strategic. At first, that felt protective. Now, it felt procedural. And procedure is not intimacy. Procedure is control disguised as efficiency. Harry began asking himself a dangerous question. If the urgency is real, why does it always point in the same direction? That question led to another. Who sets the timeline? Because whoever controls time controls outcomes. The more Harry traced decisions backward, the clearer the pattern became. He had been reacting, fast, emotionally, publicly. Others had been planning, quietly, strategically, incrementally. That doesn't mean anyone was wrong. But it does mean the partnership wasn't equal. And equality matters when the stakes are permanent. Harry started to notice how often his emotional reactions were anticipated, how scenarios seemed prepared for, how narratives were already formed, how talking points arrived quickly when uncertainty surfaced. That level of readiness is impressive, but it also raises a question. Ready for what? Spontaneous crises don't come with scripts, but managed crises do. And Harry began to suspect that not all fires were accidental. Again, not because someone lit them, but because they were allowed to burn when they served a purpose. The purpose? Momentum. Momentum keeps people from stopping, from reflecting, from renegotiating. Momentum rewards loyalty and punishes hesitation. Harry had lived on momentum for years. Now he was stepping off it. And stepping off momentum is dangerous because it reveals who was running beside you and who was steering from ahead. This shift didn't go unnoticed. The atmosphere changed. Not colder, not hostile, just tighter. More reminders of consequences. More emphasis on unity. More subtle reinforcement of stakes. And the stakes were always framed the same way. If you slow down, they win. If you hesitate, the story collapses. If you question this, everything we've built is at risk. That framing is powerful because it externalizes responsibility. You're not choosing for yourself. You're choosing for all of us. And when someone already carries guilt about family, about privilege, about history, that framing lands hard. Harry carried a lot of guilt. Guilt about his family fractures. Guilt about his children's exposure. Guilt about the chaos surrounding his choices. That guilt made him easy to persuade. But persuasion loses power once it's recognized. Harry didn't argue back. He didn't push. He did something far more destabilizing. He withdrew emotionally. An emotional withdrawal is terrifying for systems built on alignment. Because once emotional energy is removed, only structure remains. And structure reveals itself quickly. Harry began testing boundaries quietly. He delayed responses. He stopped volunteering defenses. He asked to revisit decisions instead of rushing them. And every time he did, the resistance surfaced, not as anger, but as anxiety. The anxiety wasn't about him. It was about control. Because without his emotional buy-in, the system wobbled. This is the moment Harry realized something fundamental. His loyalty wasn't just emotional support. It was structural support. He was the pillar holding the narrative upright. Remove the pillar, and everything tilts. That realization was devastating, because it meant that staying silent wasn't neutral. Silence was participation. And participation meant complicity in something he no longer fully believed in. Harry found himself standing at an internal crossroads. On one side was familiarity. On the other was uncertainty. Familiarity meant continuing as he had, absorbing pressure, maintaining narrative cohesion, protecting everyone from fallout. Uncertainty meant risk, exposure, loss of control, but it also meant honesty. And honesty was becoming non-negotiable. Harry didn't want to blow anything up. He wanted balance. It was about what he was allowed to do. That distinction changes everything. Because in a healthy partnership, disagreement leads to negotiation. In an imbalanced one, disagreement leads to containment. Harry began to notice how quickly conversations returned to optics. How will this look? What message does this send? Do you understand what they'll do with this? Again and again, the external audience was centered. Not the marriage. Not the emotional fracture. Not the questions that had been building for months. The story. The story had to be protected. And suddenly, the irony hit him with full force. He had left one institution that prioritized image over individual truth, only to find himself inside a smaller one doing the same thing. That realization didn't make him angry. It made him tired. Because he recognized the pattern. He had lived it his entire life. Only this time, it wasn't faceless. It was intimate. That's when Harry began to understand the true cost of silence. Silence wasn't neutral. Silence wasn't peacekeeping. Silence was currency. Every time he stayed quiet, something else was preserved. Not harmony, control. And the moment he stopped spending that currency freely, the system reacted. Not violently, defensively. He began hearing phrases that sounded supportive, but functioned as guardrails. Let's not rush into anything. We can address this later. Now isn't the right time. Those phrases weren't wrong. But timing, once weaponized, becomes obstruction. Because later never arrives when delay is the strategy. Harry found himself stuck in a loop. The questions mattered too much to ignore. The consequences felt too big to confront directly. That's when the pressure began shifting again. Subtly, quietly, towards something else. The children. This is where everything intensified. Because once children enter the conversation, logic gives way to fear. And fear makes leverage devastating. Every hypothetical was framed around stability. Every concern was framed around protection. Every hesitation was framed as risk. And to be clear, these concerns weren't fabricated, but they were framed. Framed in a way that made Harry's emotional autonomy feel irresponsible. If you push this, you destabilize everything. If you speak up, they suffer. If you walk away, the damage will be permanent. Those aren't threats. They're weights. And Harry felt them settle on his chest. This is the moment where many people break, where they decide the discomfort of silence is preferable to the chaos of truth. Harry came dangerously close, because he loved his children more than anything, because the idea of harming them, even indirectly, was unbearable, and because he knew how cruel the world could be to them. But here's the detail that tipped everything. He noticed how often the children were invoked, but how rarely their emotional reality was discussed. Stability was emphasized. Optics were emphasized. Continuity was emphasized. But not honesty. Not modeling boundaries. Not modeling self-respect. Not modeling what happens when something is wrong. Harry had grown up in a household where stability was prized above all else. And it didn't save anyone. That's when memory intruded. His mother's isolation. The quiet despair behind closed doors. The cost of smiling through damage. History didn't repeat itself exactly, but it echoed. And echoes are enough to wake you up. Harry realized something painful. Staying silent for the sake of stability had a price too. And that price was integrity. He wasn't being asked explicitly to lie. He was being asked to omit, to delay, to soften, to wait. But omission accumulates. And over time, omission becomes deception, especially when one person carries the weight of the truth alone. Harry felt the loneliness of that weight more acutely than ever. Because the moment he stopped being the shield, he stopped being included. Conversations happened around him. Decisions progressed without him. Information arrived after the fact. Not dramatically, casually, as if it were natural. And that casual exclusion hurt more than confrontation ever could. It told him everything he needed to know. This wasn't about reconciliation. It was about management. That's when Harry did something unexpected. He asked for everything. Not emotionally. Administratively. He requested clarity, documentation, context, not accusations, just facts. And the reaction to that request was immediate. Deflection. Why dig this up? What good will this do? You're reopening wounds. Again, reasonable questions. But they avoided the core issue. Transparency shouldn't feel dangerous, unless something depends on it not happening. Harry didn't push harder. He observed. And what he observed was telling. The more he asked for clarity, the more emphasis was placed on consequences. The more he slowed down, the more urgency appeared. The more he sought balance, the more leverage surfaced. And leverage, once visible, changes the moral landscape entirely. Because leverage turns partnership into negotiation. And negotiation implies unequal power. Harry didn't want to negotiate his marriage. He wanted to understand it. But understanding was becoming incompatible with preservation. That's when the word he had avoided fully formed in his mind. Blackmail, not in the dramatic sense. In the structural sense. Blackmail doesn't always say, do this or else. Sometimes it says, you already did this, so you can't leave now. Sometimes it says, if this comes out, everyone loses. Sometimes it says, you don't want to be responsible for that. The most effective blackmail doesn't threaten. It reminds. And Harry had been reminded, again and again, of everything he stood to lose. But something else had shifted. The fear wasn't working the same way anymore. Because fear loses power once you accept loss as inevitable. Harry was beginning to accept something he had resisted for a long time. No outcome was clean. No choice preserved everything. Something would break no matter what. The question was, what could he live with? A fractured public image? A rewritten narrative? A painful transition? Or a lifetime of silent compromise? That's not a theoretical question. That's a breaking point. Harry didn't announce anything yet. But internally, the decision tree had narrowed. He was no longer choosing between staying and leaving. He was choosing between control and truth. And once truth enters the equation, timelines collapse. Because truth doesn't wait for convenience. It demands reckoning. Harry knew that once he took the next step, whatever it was, there would be no going back. Not to the narrative, not to the roles, not to the version of the marriage built on urgency and silence. The realization didn't make him bold. It made him precise. Because precision is what people adopt when they understand the stakes. Harry wasn't planning a dramatic exit. He was planning survival. And the next move wouldn't be emotional. It would be deliberate. Because when leverage is on the table, every action becomes strategic. And Harry was done being the only one playing emotionally. What he would do next wouldn't be loud, but it would be irreversible. Because once a man stops asking for permission and starts preparing for consequences, the outcome is already in motion. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. What does a man do when he realizes emotion has been used as a weapon, and precision is the only defense left? He stops reacting. He starts planning. That shift didn't happen in a single moment. It unfolded quietly, almost invisibly. No announcements. No ultimatums. Just a subtle recalibration of how Harry moved through his own life. Because once he accepted that leverage existed, real leverage, not imagined, he understood something crucial. Every emotional move he made could be anticipated. Every impulsive reaction could be framed. Every outburst could be used against him. So he stopped giving them that. This was the most dangerous version of Harry yet. Not the angry one. Not the defiant one. The quiet one. The one who listens more than he speaks. The one who notes tone, timing, and omissions. The one who stops explaining himself. People underestimate how destabilizing silence can be when it replaces predictability. For years, Harry had been predictable. Defend, respond, escalate, protect. That rhythm was familiar, comfortable, even for everyone involved. But now, the rhythm was gone. And in its absence, something else surfaced. Nervous energy. He could feel it in conversations that lingered too long. In reassurances that arrived unprompted. In explanations that overshot the question. Over-explaining is a tell. So is preemptive justification. Harry began noticing both. He also began noticing how often conversations circled back to one theme. Control of outcome. Not healing. Not understanding. Outcome. What will this look like if? How do we manage the response if? We can't afford for this to. Every sentence leaned forward into the future, as if the present were too dangerous to examine. That's when Harry realized something else. No one was asking how he felt anymore. They were asking what he might do. And that distinction matters. Because once people stop caring about your emotional state and start managing your potential actions, the relationship has already changed. Harry didn't confront this head-on. He started doing something far more revealing. He let people talk. He asked open-ended questions and waited. And what came back wasn't reassurance. It was containment. Language designed to limit scope, to narrow options, to keep him inside invisible boundaries. You don't need to do anything drastic. Let's not overreact. We just need to hold steady. Hold steady. Those words sound stabilizing, but they also imply one thing clearly. Don't move. Harry understood that instruction better than anyone. He had grown up in a system that valued stillness over truth, where emotional suppression was framed as dignity, where endurance was mistaken for strength. He had escaped that once. He wasn't willing to rebuild it inside his marriage. That realization didn't harden him. It clarified him. Because clarity removes the need for drama. Harry began organizing his life differently. He reviewed timelines. He revisited conversations. He reconstructed decision trees. Not emotionally, logistically. He wanted to know when certain choices had been made, who had been consulted, and what information had been available at the time. Not to assign blame, to assess agency. And the more he assessed, the more one conclusion became unavoidable. He had made permanent decisions under temporary conditions. Urgency had been the constant justification. Crisis the permanent backdrop. But crisis is not a foundation. It's a catalyst. And catalysts are meant to be temporary. Harry began to wonder what would happen if he refused to operate in crisis mode anymore. So he tried it. He slowed everything down. He asked for time where time had previously been framed as impossible. He requested space where space had been framed as dangerous. And the response to that experiment was immediate. The pressure didn't increase dramatically. It sharpened. Suddenly, consequences were spoken more clearly. Risks were articulated more explicitly. Scenarios were outlined in careful detail. This could lead to legal complications. This could impact custody arrangements. This could change how institutions respond. These weren't threats. They were forecasts. And forecasts are powerful because they shift responsibility. If you proceed, you chose this outcome. Harry recognized the tactic instantly. It was the same one institutions had used on him his entire life. We're not stopping you. We're just explaining the consequences. That realization stung, because it meant the dynamic he thought he'd escaped had quietly reassembled itself around him. This time, however, he wasn't a child. He was a man with resources, advisors, and something he'd never fully possessed before. Perspective. Harry didn't argue with the forecasts. He accepted them. And acceptance disarms leverage. Once you accept that loss is possible, maybe even inevitable, the fear of it loses its grip. Harry began to mentally rehearse worst-case scenarios. Public backlash, legal battles, narrative warfare. He imagined life on the other side of all of it. And here's what surprised him. It wasn't emptiness he saw. It was relief. Not relief from responsibility, but relief from pretense. The pretense that everything could be fixed if he just tried harder. The pretense that silence was noble. The pretense that enduring imbalance was love. Harry realized he had been confusing endurance with intimacy. And endurance is not a relationship strategy. It's a survival tactic. Once survival stops being the goal, everything changes. He began seeking advice quietly. Not from people invested in the narrative, but from people invested in outcomes. People who asked different questions. What do you want your life to look like in 5 years? What values are non-negotiable? What are you willing to lose? Those questions hit differently. Because for the first time in a long time, the future wasn't framed as something to be defended. It was something to be chosen. And choice is dangerous when leverage exists, because it threatens the balance of power. Harry didn't announce his shift, but those around him felt it. He became harder to read, harder to steer, harder to reassure. He stopped responding emotionally to emotional cues. That's when frustration began leaking through the cracks. Not openly, indirectly. You're being distant. You're not present. You're shutting down. Those statements reframed his boundary setting as a personal failing. But Harry didn't flinch, because he recognized the pattern now. When someone benefits from your emotional availability, your withdrawal feels like abandonment, even if it's self-protection. Harry wasn't abandoning anyone. He was reclaiming himself. And reclaiming yourself is disruptive. It forces everyone else to renegotiate their position. This is where the story takes a sharp turn. Because once Harry stopped being emotionally predictable, the stakes shifted. The leverage had to evolve. And that's when the conversation changed. From narrative to law, from optics to agreements, from emotional framing to formal implications. This is the moment many people miss. The moment where love quietly exits the room and strategy takes its place. Harry noticed how quickly discussions began referencing documents, structures, precedents. The marriage was no longer being discussed as a relationship. It was being discussed as a construct. And constructs can be dismantled, but only if you're willing to face what's underneath them. Harry knew that once legal frameworks entered the picture, everything would accelerate. Because law doesn't operate on emotion. It operates on facts, leverage, and timing. And timing was finally on his side. Harry hadn't made a move yet, but he had made a decision. He would no longer be the only one exposed. He would no longer absorb risk silently. He would no longer be managed through fear. Whatever came next would be faced openly, even if it was painful. Because the alternative was a life of quiet erosion. And erosion destroys slowly, invisibly, until there's nothing left to defend. Harry wasn't ready to declare anything publicly, but privately, the path was narrowing fast. The next step would involve names, documents, boundaries that couldn't be walked back. Once he crossed that threshold, the marriage wouldn't just change. It would transform into something else entirely. Something colder, something formal, something irreversible. Because once love becomes a legal question, the emotional chapter has already ended. And Harry was standing at the edge of that chapter now, knowing full well that once he stepped forward, there would be no return to the illusion of before. But what came next wouldn't unfold behind closed doors. It would unfold in a way no one could contain. Because the moment private strategy turns into public reality, the story escapes everyone's control. And that was the moment Harry was preparing for. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. What happens when preparation quietly replaces hope? Because the moment Harry accepted that love had given way to structure, everything accelerated internally. Even if nothing looked different on the surface, this is the phase no one sees. The phase where decisions are no longer emotional, but procedural. Where conversations stop being about how things feel and start being about how things work. And once that shift happens, there is no path back to innocence. Harry began to understand something that terrified him more than confrontation ever could. The marriage had entered its endgame long before anyone said the word divorce. Not because love vanished overnight, but because trust had stopped being mutual. That distinction matters. Trust isn't about believing someone cares. It's about believing they will not use your vulnerability as leverage. And leverage had already entered the room. The language gave it away. Everything was suddenly framed in terms of exposure. What could leak? What could be misinterpreted? What could spiral? Those weren't emotional concerns. They were risk assessments. Harry noticed how often the phrase, "you don't want this," came up. Not, "we don't want this." You. That subtle shift landed hard. Because it clarified something he'd been avoiding. The consequences being outlined weren't shared consequences. They were his. His reputation. His credibility. His standing as a father. His future access. The more he listened, the clearer the asymmetry became. This wasn't a shared crisis. It was a managed one. And he was the variable being managed. Harry didn't confront that realization directly. He did something quieter and far more destabilizing. He stopped negotiating emotionally. Instead, he began asking neutral questions. Not why, but how. How would this actually unfold? How would decisions be made? How would information be shared? Those questions don't accuse. They clarify. And clarity is dangerous when systems depend on ambiguity. The answers he received were careful, vague in places they didn't need to be, specific in places that reinforced caution. Every path forward seemed to funnel into the same outcome. Delay, silence, maintenance. That's when Harry understood the core conflict. He wanted resolution. The system wanted preservation. And those two goals were no longer compatible. Harry began mentally separating two things he had long treated as inseparable. The marriage, the narrative. For years, they had been fused. To challenge one was to endanger the other. But now he saw the cost of that fusion. If the narrative required his silence, then silence was no longer neutral. It was a sacrifice, and sacrifices are only meaningful when they are voluntary. Harry realized his were no longer voluntary. They were expected. That expectation changed everything. Because expectation turns love into obligation, and obligation suffocates intimacy. This is the point where many people crack publicly. They lash out. They expose. They detonate the situation just to regain a sense of agency. Harry did the opposite. He became meticulous. He began documenting timelines.